As we get going this morning, we're continuing in a series that I've titled just simply, God is with us. And just as a bit of a recap, the first week we talked about Adam and Eve and about how God was with them before they sinned and after they sinned. In fact, God was even present with them during their time of sin. And then last week we talked about the story of Abram and Sarai, how God had promised they would become this great nation, but it wasn't happening. And so they took matters into their own hands, and Abram slept with Hagar. And if you were here, you'll know just all the challenges that brought forward for them. If you can remember the name of the son they had, put that into the live chat, and I've got a $5 gift card for you as well. If you can remember the name of the son between Abram and Hagar. And as we get going this morning, we kind of follow along into that story because God is faithful to his promise to Abram and Sarai. And he does give them a son of their own, and his name was Isaac. And so that's the promised son, the promised offspring they've been waiting for, who's going to help build them into this great nation. And so Isaac grows up, and he gets married to a woman named Rebekah, and this is going to be the couple now who's really going to grow that family, except Rebekah is barren. She can't have any kids, and so Isaac is on his knees praying for his wife, and God hears his prayer and answers him, and Rebekah is pregnant. If you've ever gone through pregnancy before, maybe you can relate to these words of Rebekah's. As she cries out to God, she says this, "Why is this happening to me?" There's this turmoil, this battle going on inside of her stomach. And so God answers her prayer. Let me read these words for you. It says this. This is God speaking. "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." It's a strange thing for God to say, isn't it? Rebekah says, "Why is there this battle going on?" And God says, "Hey, you're going to have twins. You've got two sons in that tummy of yours, and," this is one of the strangest things he says, "the older will serve the younger." That never happened. Being the oldest was always best, and so we'll kind of talk about that a little bit more as we go through. Here's what happens. It's time to deliver the babies, and as the first baby comes out, he is just super crazy hairy, and so they name him Harry. His name is Esau, which means hairy. How hairy was this kid that the first thing you say is, well, we got to name him that? Anyway, that's what happens. And as that first baby boy is being delivered, as they pull out his last leg, his last foot, there's this teeny tiny baby hand hanging onto his heel. It's his younger brother, younger by just seconds. And so they name him Jacob, which means heel grasper, or it's kind of an idiom for deceiver or cheater. And so that's what happens. Out come these two boys, and they grow up. And here's just kind of a parenting tip, because here's something that happens. The dad loves Esau, the firstborn, but the mom prefers Jacob, the secondborn. First of all, you shouldn't love one of your kids more than the other. If you do, don't let them know. But Jacob and Esau see this division, this separation, that the dad favors the oldest while the mom favors the youngest. So let's get back to that idea of the older will serve the younger. How does that happen? Well, it happens in two ways. The first way is this. Esau, the older brother, was this outdoors guy, this hunter, and he goes off one day and he's hunting. We don't know how long he's gone, but when he comes back home, he's famished. He's starving. He comes into the house, and there's his younger brother, Jacob, watching cooking shows and making a meal, because Jacob was a homebody. Esau is this rough and rugged outdoors guy. Jacob just liked to stay home and cook. And so the older brother Esau says to Jacob, "Hey, give me some of that food you're eating. I'm going to die. I'm so hungry." And Jacob says this to him, "First, sell me your birthright." Esau says, "Look, I'm about to die. What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. Okay. that scene is crazy because it's just so dumb. Is Esau really about to drop dead on the floor? Does he have no strength left that he can't grab a bite to eat on his own? And why would you ever trade your birthright, which meant a double portion of the inheritance? It meant that you would be the next leader in your family, and it meant that you would get the blessing God had put on your family. Your children would receive that blessing given to Abraham. Why would you trade all of that for a bowl of Campbell's chunky soup? I have no idea, but that's exactly what happens. So Jacob kind of buys or trades the birthright from his older brother Esau. The second way that Jacob gets the blessing is even shadier than that. See, their dad, Isaac, gets older, quite a bit older, and he's almost blind, and he's on his deathbed. And so he talks to Esau and says, hey, go out hunting one more time. Catch something for me, some wild game. Come back and make me my last meal, and then I'll bless you. And so off Esau goes on kind of this last hunt for his father. But Rebekah overheard that. And Rebekah wants Jacob to be blessed. And so while Esau's out hunting, Rebekah just microwaves some hamburger helper, something like that, prepares this meal, and she disguises Jacob as Esau. Remember, Esau was a hairy guy? This is how hairy he is. Rebekah covers up Jacob's arms and his neck with goat skin. Sounds gross. Then they put on one of Esau's robes on Jacob, and she sends Jacob disguised into Isaac. And Isaac is suspicious. He says, how did you get back so fast? God must have really blessed you on that hunt. And he says, come on over a little bit closer to me. And he puts his hand on Jacob's goat skin covered arms and says, yep, that feels like my son Esau. And then he leans in for a hug and he smells the robe that he's wearing. Yeah, that smells like my son Esau. And so Isaac gives the family blessing to Jacob. He's tricked. He's deceived. And when Esau gets home, he cannot believe it. He's furious. He's weeping. He's crying out to his father, bless me too. Don't you have any blessing left to give to me? And then after being just tormented by that, then he is enraged. He's so angry, he says, once I'm done grieving for my dead father, I'm going to kill my brother. This might as well be a double funeral because Jacob is dead. He's a dead man. Well, God warns Jacob about this, and Rebekah, his mom, is telling him about this plot as well. And so God says these words to Jacob. He says, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. Hold on a second. I skipped part. I missed part. He flees. Jacob flees, knowing that his brother Esau wants to kill him. He goes to a land where he ends up getting married. He meets two sisters, marries them both. Here's another pro dating tip for you. If you meet two sisters, don't date both of them. If you do date both of them, don't marry both of them. This turns into a total disaster for Jacob and his two wives. But anyway, that's what happens. He gets married to these two girls, and he's so blessed there, just with his herds, his flocks, just more and more. He just grows in wealth so much that his father-in-law and his brothers-in-law start to despise him as well, because they're afraid he's taking away all of their inheritance. Everything that their fathers built up, Jacob's winning over for himself, and so they want to get rid of him as well. That's when God appears to Jacob and says this to him, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. Well, this sounds like a great plan, right? God says, go back to where you're from. Bring your family, bring your wealth, bring your herds, flocks, camels, everything else, and I'll be with you as you go. Great plan, except who's waiting back home for Jacob? Esau, his brother Esau, who's been angry now for 20 years, just waiting for the chance to kill his younger brother who stole the birthright. So Jacob's nervous, obviously nervous about this. And this is kind of a great reminder for us that sometimes faithfulness to God is frightening. I mean, Jacob is terrified as we go along. We see his fear. We see his terror as he heads back to his homeland, knowing that his brother's going to be waiting for him. And so he sends some messengers ahead of him who go ahead and he tells them, tell them that your brother's coming back. Call me his servant, and hopefully that'll smooth things over for me. The messengers come back and they relay this message. We went to your brother Esau, and now he's coming to meet you, and 400 men are with him. Well, it's quite the message, isn't it? This doesn't sound like a welcome party. 400 men sounds a whole lot more like an army. That Esau's heard it's his chance. His time is coming, and he is just going to squash his brother as he comes back to town. And so Jacob divides everything he has into two camps. I mean, just think about this strategy. He divides half his family on this side, half his family on this side, half his wealth over here, half his wealth over there. And he says, hey, if my brother Esau comes and kills one of the camps, maybe he thinks that's all of us, and I'll get to keep the other half of my family. Man, I don't know what your family dynamics are like, but this one is bad. This is just a total disaster. So he does that. He divides his family up, and then he starts to send them out in droves ahead of him. He starts to send out groups, and he sends out a group of animals with a bit of family, and then spaces them out, and then sends another group out, and then sends another group out. And his thought is this, that each group of people will be bringing a gift to his brother. He sends over 550 different groups of animals, 550, not counting the youngest ones. And he sends them ahead trying to appease his brother. It seems like a mess. It seems like a real mess. And then he prays this prayer. He says this, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, that I may do you good. I'm not worthy of the least of the deeds of steadfast love and all the faithfulness that you've shown to your servant. For with only my staff I crossed this Jordan, and now I've become two camps. Please deliver me from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau, for I fear him, that he may come and attack me, the mothers with the children. But you said, I will surely do you good, and make your offspring as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Man, just think about that prayer a little bit. In that prayer, Jacob says to God, don't forget me, I'm Abraham's son. I'm a son of the promise. I'm a son of this blessing that you've poured out on my grandfather, Abraham, and my dad, Isaac. And then he says this, you told me to return to this land and you'd be good to me. Don't forget that either, God. I'm a son of the promise, and you promised to be good to me as I'm faithful to you. And then he says, I don't deserve any of it. When I first left, I entered this land with just the walking stick in my hand, but now look at this family you've blessed me with. Look at the riches that I have here. I've got so much. I've been so blessed. I could divide it into two camps, and it's still a whole lot more than I ever deserved. Then he gives his request to God. Please save me. Please deliver me. Please protect me from my brother. Protect my wives and my children. And then he closes by saying one more time, God, remember you promised that you would be good to me. That's a powerful prayer. I'd encourage you to go back later and just read through that prayer again from Genesis chapter 32 here. God, remember your promise to me. I don't deserve anything you've given, but you said you'd be good, so please keep your word. There's some things in this story so far that I don't understand. There's some things here that I don't really get. For example, I don't get if God wanted to bless Jacob, the younger son, why doesn't he just have Jacob be born first? Right? That'd be a whole lot easier. You could skip the grasping. You could skip the selling of the birthright for a bowl of soup. You could skip the deception with the father. I don't get why God chooses to bless the younger over Esau. The only thing that kind of makes maybe sense to me is this. God's blessing isn't determined by our birth order. That we can lay no claim at all on God's blessing, that he blesses because it's his pleasure to bless. He doesn't bless someone because he has to. He isn't obligated to them. He blesses people because it's his privilege and his pleasure to do that. And same with Esau. Esau just assumes he's going to get blessed because he's firstborn. Well, he didn't do anything to earn that. And so God here shows again, Esau's been blessed as well, just with a different blessing. That's one of the things that I just find interesting, that God blesses, and God's desires to bless you too. It doesn't matter if you're the oldest or the youngest, doesn't matter what job you have, what your family makeup looks like, what career you're working towards, or what's going on in your life. God's desire is to bless you. The second thing that I just find interesting here is this. Jacob's so desperate for the blessing of God. He's so desperate. He reminds God a couple times in this prayer, remember, you said you would bless me. Remember, you said that you were going to take good care of me. And it makes me wonder if maybe Jacob's blind. Maybe he just doesn't see how much God has already blessed him so far through this whole story. God's just been blessing him upon blessing, upon blessing, upon blessing. And it makes me wonder about us, church. How often are we blind to the blessing that God's pouring into our lives? How often do we look around at our house, our car in the garage, our cupboards that are totally overflowing, our freezer where you have to sit on the lid to make it close, the family, the people in our lives, and we look and we say, I wish God would just bless me. Meanwhile, we're almost drowning in the blessings that he's poured out on us. There's so much. I wonder if Jacob's kind of fallen into that trap too, where he just can't see, just can't get his eyes on all these blessings, maybe because there's just so many of them. Here's one more thing I don't totally get about Jacob and this part of the story. Why isn't God Jacob's plan A? God's blessed him so much. Why isn't the first thing that Jacob does is fall to his knees and cry out to God? Instead, his plan A is he's going to send messengers ahead and make sure it's kind of smooth sailings between him and his brother. His plan B is that he's going to divide the camp up so that only half of his family gets wiped out. It's not till plan C where he says, okay, God, I hope you bless me in this plan I made. Does that sound like you, or does that sound like someone you know, where first they put all the steps, the whole plan is in place, and then they say to God, hey, God, by the way, this is the plan. Bless it, okay? God, this is what we're going to do. You're on side with me, right? Why don't we call out to God first? Why doesn't Jacob call out to God first when God is right there saying, I'm going to bless you? Through this whole story, God's saying, I'm blessing you, and still Jacob's plan A and B don't involve God at all. Well, this is what happens. He starts to send out those groups of people and sending out those animals as gifts ahead of him as well, hoping to win his brother's favor. He sends them all off ahead of him, and finally he's alone. Let me read what happens next. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob replied, I will not let you go unless you bless me. The man asked him, what is your name? Jacob, he answered. Then the man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. In the midst of all this chaos, this moving away from his brother and father-in-law and moving towards his brother who's marching towards him with this huge army, Jacob sent his family ahead of him, sent everything off ahead of him, and he's finally alone. He has just this moment of solitude and peace, and the stars are shining brightly, and there's just a coolness in the air, and all of a sudden he gets a right hook right across the face, poof, just like that, out of nowhere, and he's suddenly in this wrestling match. He doesn't even know who he's wrestling. I mean, can you imagine the confusion? Is this Esau? Is this a spy, an assassin he sent ahead of him? He has no idea, but suddenly he's full on into this wrestling match, and it goes all night, right until daybreak. When's the last time you wrestled with somebody? I mean, that is exhausting. I can't imagine wrestling for hour after hour. But there they go. Sometimes I wrestle with my kids, and after 5 minutes, I'm just exhausted of that. I always win, by the way. But last week, I was wrestling with Judah, and he did a double foot drop kick right in the guts. I had to tap out. I think that's the one time I've been beaten. I was like, oh, buddy, I need a little break now. But here they are, they're wrestling away, and Jacob doesn't even know who it is, but we learn at the end that it's God. Jacob says, I've seen the Lord face to face here. This is incredible. Last week, I used a word that means that God's appeared. Remember that word? It was theophany, when God appears to someone in the Old Testament. Here's just a test for you, a quiz, and I'll give you a $5 gift card to whoever gets the answer first. What's it called when Christ appears to someone? When God appears, it's called a theophany. What's it called when God appears to someone? Put that in the comments, and I'll see who gets that answer right first. Okay, so that's what happens. They're wrestling all night, they're fighting all night, and we, most commentators believe that this, or theologians believe that this is actually Jesus, that Jesus has appeared again, just like we think he did in the last story, that he has appeared and he is wrestling with Jacob, which raises the question, why can't Jesus beat Jacob? I mean, why do they wrestle all night? You'd think this would be easy since Jesus is God. Here's why. Actually, I heard Rich Wilkinson say this. He said, God didn't wrestle to show his strength. He wrestled for Jacob to admit his weakness. At any point, Jesus could have beaten Jacob, and we see that as the fight goes on because it says that he just reaches out and touches his hip, just like that. And it wrenches Jacob's hip. He can't fight anymore. Just like that, just with a touch, like that. And the fight is over. Just that quickly. Because God has that power. Jesus has that power. So this whole thing actually reminds me of one of my favorite things from my childhood. I've shared this with you guys before. One of the things I loved to do was watch wrestling. Saturday afternoon, wrestling, my family would gather around the TV, our neighbor would come over, we'd sit and watch all these just giants of men wrestling and fighting. But something I learned as I got a bit older, and I don't want to, spoiler alert if you're a big WWE fan now, but all of that fighting, it's all staged. Some of you women might need to console the men in your lives right now if they weren't aware of that before. But it's all staged. It's all planned out in advance. In fact, it's choreographed like a dance. I'll do this move, then you do this move, then I'll jump off the rope, then I'll flip, you over here, and then I'll pin you, but you'll kick out. It's all planned out in advance, move to move. Even how long the fight's going to go on is planned out in advance. God could have beaten Jacob at any moment. Any moment he could have beaten Jacob. No problem. This is not a fair fight. This isn't a match. It's all staged and all planned. We know that it's planned. Because here God just shows up out of the blue. It's not like he stumbled along and ran into Jacob and got upset and decided to fight him. He comes with that whole intention. And we know he could have stopped the fight at any time because when he touches his hip, just like that, the fight is over. And Jacob's so wounded, so hurt. It's not a fight anymore. He's just hanging on. He's just still barely hanging on to Jesus as this wrestling continues. And so God asks him to let him go, and he says, I won't. I won't let go until you bless me. Just looking at the comments here, Christine Velez, you got it right, Christophany. That's what it means when Jesus appears, a Christophany. Look again at Jacob. He's so desperate. I mean, he's been so injured in this fight. He's been fighting all night. He's been wrestling with God. He's just beaten up and bruised. Now his hip is out of socket. And there's this issue, this challenge, where God says, let me go. And Jacob says, I won't. I'm still hanging on until you bless me. I'm not letting go until you bless me, God. It's fascinating to look at this story the whole way through and to see how desperate Jacob is to be blessed. I mean, it's interesting, he's still calling out for a blessing here because his life has been so blessed the whole way along, the whole story along. God has just been blessing him with more and more and more. And here he cries out again, I'm not letting go unless you bless me, God. You know, in the story earlier, we see these two brothers ready to kill one another because they're so desperate to be blessed. And it makes me wonder, church, why aren't we crying out for blessing more? Why aren't we calling out to God like these brothers are, saying, bless me, I want the blessing, give the blessing to me, reminding God in their prayers, remember God, you said that you'd be good to me, remember that you said that you would bless me. Why don't we have that same kind of physical, emotional, spiritual response to God and His Word? I feel like sometimes we're just so laissez-faire about our relationship with God. Like, yeah, God, if you bless me, that's great. But if you don't, I've already got a good job and a family, a house, a car. I mean, I'm doing fine without your blessing in my lives. I mean, first of all, it's just being so blind and ignorant about the blessings God has poured into our lives. But why aren't we crying out for more of it? I wonder on one hand if maybe Jacob was ignorant of the blessing in his lives, but maybe on the other end of the spectrum, maybe he realized how desperately he needed God's blessing. That he had tasted God's blessing and it was just so good. And he said, I just want more of that. Whatever I can do to get more of that blessing, that's what I'm going to do. I mean, think about something that you've tasted before and it was just so good. Your first scoop of Moose Tracks ice cream and you said, oh, this is so good. Forget the bowl. I'm just going to eat the whole carton. I want more and more of this. That's Jacob crying out to God here. I want more. I need more of this. It's interesting, in the Genesis account, we're just told that Jacob asks for a blessing. I won't let you go unless you bless me. But in the prophet Hosea, he writes about this account, this wrestling, and he says this: in the womb, he grasped his brother's heel. As a man, he struggled with God. He struggled, he wept, and he begged for his favor. Just think about the passion and energy in that. He struggles, he weeps, he begs God for his favor. Church, I hope that we can kind of copy Jacob's desire for blessing, that we would be struggling and wrestling and crying out and weeping for God's blessing, that would be the most important thing to us, the most important thing in our lives. Let me ask you this. What are you willing to wrestle and fight for? What are you wrestling with right now? What are you wrestling with God or with things that are going on in your lives? I can tell you some of the things I'm wrestling with. I'm wrestling with churches being closed again. I'm so thankful that we can meet online like this, but I'm wrestling with that decision. All churches are closed. What's fascinating to me is on Tuesday night, I'm allowed to bring 200 people to the movie theater with me. For 2 hours, we're going to sit there in the same room and watch a movie. Why can't we gather together, 50 of us, and put our masks on and not sing songs? How is that any riskier or more dangerous than a movie theater? I struggle with that. I'm wrestling with that. Or I'm wrestling with... Well, actually, I'm having this idea that maybe I should just rent the movie theater next Sunday. 200 of us can gather there, and I'll just preach a sermon while the star's playing in the background. But anyway, we won't do that. I'm wrestling with this idea that 1,000 people can be marching around in Walmart coughing and sneezing and touching everything. But again, we can't gather here. I mean, we had all these great protocols. What if they just said, wear a mask all the time? I mean, what if we just were doing that in the building? We already had done so many other things. I'm wrestling with the thought of, can we ever reasonably expect a secular atheist government to value a spiritual house like this? Why would we ever think that that would happen? How could we expect a secular federal government, atheist government, to ever value and prioritize spiritual things or ever be faithful to them? I mean, it's just as foolish to even think about, and yet that continues to be my hope, that we'd have godly, faithful leaders ruling over us. You know, I'm wrestling with people who are young and healthy, and they're going to work, and they're going to school, and they're going everywhere else, but they're still not coming to church for those months that we were able to gather. Why not? Why can't we gather together? Why is everything else prioritized instead of that? And I'd love to hear from you. Why have you made that decision? Because we know that this is a place of God's blessing where we gather together to be a blessing to one another. And maybe you don't feel like you need to be here for yourself, but we would have loved to have seen you, and we would just hope and pray that when the doors open again, that you would come and join us together as God's family. Man, I'm wrestling with the idea that sometimes my life, and maybe yours too, looks a lot more like the lives of just everyone else around me than the life of Jesus. That I would just blend in just as easily with my atheist friends as I would with a group of Christians. I'm wrestling with all of those things. Yesterday, our family went to Tynehead Park, and we watched some of the salmon swimming upstream, and it is phenomenal. I mean, these salmon are just red, and they're just like crawling almost as they kind of flap themselves over the rocks. They're fighting their way against the current and getting pushed back and then pushing on again, and they give everything they've got, every ounce of energy they have to make it back home. Are we putting that kind of energy, that kind of fight, into making sure that we get home? That we keep clinging to Jesus all the way home? Man, I'd love to see that kind of passion, that fight, that struggle, where clinging to Him is just the most important thing, not only just for you, but also for your family. We say, hey, listen, we're going to do this. We're going to be doing devotions together. We're going to be praying together. We're going to be worshiping together. We're going to be singing praise songs together. If the doors are open for the church, we're going to be there together because Jesus is our number one priority. There's a blessing for Jacob in the wrestling. There's a blessing in that. There's a blessing because at some point, Jacob realizes he's beaten, that he desperately needs God. There's a blessing in the wrestling because in the midst of the wrestling, Jacob is given a new name and a new identity. He was named when he was born the heel grasper or deceiver. And he had just kind of embodied that name, hadn't he? I mean, again and again, he lies, he cheats, he steals, he get lied and cheated. He's always kind of just trying to force his way to get ahead. But he's given a new name. Instead of heel grabber and cheater, he's given a name that means prince or God's fighter, because he wrestles with God and man and overcomes. And that identity changes him. It shapes him moving forward. And what's fascinating, if you read through Genesis, it flops back and forth. Sometimes they call him Israel, but sometimes they call him Jacob. And for me, that's just kind of a reminder that he's struggling back and forth, that sometimes he slips into his old name and old ways and old habits, but sometimes he pushes forward and he does embody that fighter, that champion for God. Jacob's blessed in this wrestling even as he's blessed with a limp. Remember, Jesus touches his hip, and from that point on, he walks with a limp, which means that everywhere he goes, he's reminded that he wrestled with God and that God is with him. I mean, could you think about that? I mean, just think about the scars, the wounds, the journeys, the limps that you've taken on as you've wrestled with God and as you've wrestled with people. We're always so prone to want to hide those things. We're ashamed of them. We try and cover them up. We don't want anyone to notice. We walk like we're fine even though we're not, because we don't want anyone to see. But this limp tells a beautiful story about a God who blesses him. But God who's with him, that he was with him before he was even born, and he was with him through all the wrestling and the struggling, and he's with him after as Jacob walks with this limp. You know, it says that the first thing that happens after God disappears here is he looks up, and here comes Esau. And there's no time for him to do anything, but this is where we see that he's already a changed man. Because it says that instead of letting his parties go ahead of him like he'd originally planned, instead of doing that now, he limps his way to the front of the line. And he bows down 7 times before his brother and reconciles with him. He's changed, church. And I hope that as you wrestle with God, as you struggle with him, as you struggle going through his word and just conforming your life to his life, as you wrestle through things going on in our society, man, as I'm sitting here, I just keep thinking of more and more things where I feel like, man, I'm struggling with that. I'm struggling with how we've moved from kind of putting religion on a pedestal, then we put science above religion, said whatever science proves, that's what we're going to believe. But now we've put feelings above science and religion. We've said, well, whatever you feel, that's your truth. How many times do you see people post that online or say it, well, it's my truth? There's not supposed to be all these different truths. There's just one truth. Jesus is the truth, and if you know him, he sets you free. I'm struggling as I sit here and think about it, about the idea. When I was in school, you know, the teacher would sit us all down and say, boys and girls, you can be anything you want to be. But they didn't mean that the boys could be the girls and the girls could be the boys. There was kind of this sense of gender and sexuality, and now it's just kind of whatever you feel. I'm struggling with that. I'm wrestling with that. Does God love all of us? Absolutely. Does God bless all of us? Absolutely. If we cried out, would he bless us more? Absolutely. I think that he would. Church, I hope that you can see all the blessings that God has poured into your life and that you can see yourself being changed by him and that you wouldn't hide the scars. This morning before this live stream, I had the privilege of baptizing a baby, Dallas James Tremblay. And it's just such a gift because I got to say to them, God's at work right here in this baby. Church, if you have the scars, I'd encourage you to share them and tell those stories of wrestling with God. You know, as we think about scars and wrestling, of course, my mind goes to the night of the resurrection. And the disciples are all gathered together, and Jesus appears in his midst. And what does he do? He shows them the scars. He shows them the scars because they tell such a beautiful story about God's incredible pursuing love, that God loved them before they were even born, that God loved them as he promised to build this nation, that God loved as he pursued them again through priests and prophets and kings, that God loved them as he comes to them in the flesh, Jesus. Next week we start Advent as we start thinking about and preparing for Jesus to come, that he came in the past and we want to remember that, but he's coming again and we want to not forget that promise. Church, I hope that as you look at Jesus, as you look through the story of Jacob, that you'd be reminded of God's incredible blessing to you, that he loves you because he loves you, because he loves you, and it's his privilege and his pleasure to bless you because that's what he wants to do. Let's pray together. Gracious Heavenly Father, I thank you for this morning. I thank you for your word that's living and active. And as we read through the story of Jacob, this guy who struggled and wrestled and wanted your blessing so badly, God, I pray that you would put that on our hearts as well, that we would be prepared to wrestle and struggle, that we'd wrestle and struggle with your word and not stop wrestling until we've agreed with you, until we've admitted that you're right, until we've admitted that we're so dependent and need you so badly, God. And I pray that you would put it on our hearts and minds to cry out for blessing, that we would just hunger more and more to be blessed by you, that you'd open our eyes to the blessing that you've already poured out, and that we would just desire more and more as we taste and see that it's good, that we'd keep on calling out for more, not just for us as individuals, for our family, for our church, for our school, for our community, for our neighbors, for our country. And God, as we wrestle, I pray that we'd keep coming back to you, and that we'd actually shape our lives just like Jacob did in his prayer, that we'd shape our lives around your promises and not the things that anyone else promises us, not things that the world promises us, but that we would just cling to your promises, God, saying, you promised us this. And so we're going to trust it. We're going to cling to it. Help us to keep clinging to you, Jesus. In your name we ask it. Amen. I want to give you just a minute. We normally do this at the start of our service, but it seemed to fit here maybe now. Just a minute to silently confess to God. Whatever God has put on your heart this morning, whatever you have been carrying, whatever burdens you're struggling with, just to confess that to God. And church, now let me tell you this, that whatever you confess to God, he has forgiven. He's forgiven it in full. It's not there anymore. It's gone as far as God is concerned. You are the forgiven children of God, loved and blessed by him. I want to close with a song and a blessing.